Hello and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Joel Schwartz, who is a licensed clinical psychologist. He's actually the one that coined the term Neurodiversity Affirmative Therapy and ADHDer, and he specializes in therapy and testing for the misunderstood. And today we unpack ADHD and autism. We really unpack these topics. There is so much information on this. Joel is an expert in this area. I'm so privileged to have him on the podcast. And if after this podcast you have questions, I want you to go ahead and drop them in the comments. If there's enough questions, then we will do a follow-up Q&A. So I really hope you enjoy this podcast. I definitely did. I think that this is a topic that is so important. And if you do, please take a moment to give us a like, a share, and a subscribe. And I'm going to hop on in with Joel. I hope you'll enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast, a place to explore possibility through mindfulness, movement, and self-discovery. Our intention is to deliver insight and inspiration while fostering conversations that are genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. We hope you will enjoy today's episode. Hi, Joel. Welcome to the Connected Community Podcast.
Hello, Nikki.
I'm excited to have you.
Thank you.
I'm so interested in this topic that we're going to talk about today. But to start, you're a licensed clinical psychologist that does private practice in San Luis Obispo, which is kind of a cool area in California.
Yep.
You coined the term Neurodiversity Affirmative Therapy and ADHDer as a way to validify having that identity with ADHD. And you specialize in therapy and treating and testing people that are misunderstood. And I just love that. I love that that's kind of like your caveat. Like I'm working with people that are misunderstood because I think that as we unpacked neurodiversity and ADHD and autism, there's a lot of things that we misunderstand, and myself included. So I know that when you and I talked initially, you were kind of correcting my terminology, which I really appreciate because I want to be in that right terminology around these topics. And so I guess let's just start with, for people that are brand new to this conversation, how do we define neurodiversity? What is that?
Neurodiversity means different neurological systems. Neurodiversity is a fact of life, just like we have diversity of height, skin color, eyes. There's also diversity of brains and nervous systems. So neurodiversity is just the idea that there's diversity of brains, diversity of nervous systems. And from that, we have the neurodiversity movement, which seeks to look at neurological differences through a lens of liberation. So similarly, as we see diversity of sexuality and gender and the sort of political and identity and marginalization issues that come up, so can we see the same with people who are neurologically different. And, this is often applied to people who are autistic or ADHDers like myself, but really can encompass any neurological difference to be seen through a lens of self-determination, support, need for acceptance, identifying social barriers to functioning and meaningful life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then when you and I were talking, I would love for you to explain the difference between identity first language, being an autistic person, and then first person language, and then why it matters. Because I think there's like these little changes that we can make in our language. And sometimes I think that they take time to kind of make these. But if we can talk about why it's important, then I think people will understand.
Yeah. Most of us were trained, and I still think it's probably the norm to say things like a person with autism, a person with schizophrenia, person with fill in the blank. And this was originally thought to center the person, but actually starting with disability advocates, who started calling themselves disabled people instead of people with disabilities. recognizing that the experience of disability is central to an experience of who they are, that it influences the way they are in the world, and that the way that identity politics might work if you call somebody a gay person, a Jewish person, a black person, um, operate in the sort of the same way as being a disabled person. And so, autistic advocates started calling themselves autistic people instead of people with autism. Um, and we don't have a corollary for ADHD because the D disorder is inherently in ADHD. So I came up
Mm-hmm.
with this idea of started calling myself an ADHDer,
Mm-hmm.
instead of a person with ADHD. Um, there's been this term that's come up called vast variable attention stimulus trait people, that I believe is Dr. Ned Hallowell came up with that idea. And in some neurodiversity circles, they're adopting that instead of ADHD because the second D disorder inherently makes it something disordered about the person. And neurodiversity advocates say these are just different brains that operate with strengths and weaknesses like any other brain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, what are some things that people sometimes say with the best of intentions that kind of
Mm-hmm.
might not land right, or they feel in like they're invalidating that person?
Yeah. I think when people boil down experiences of disability to annoyances, so, oh, we're all a little bit autistic. Um, it's the same as saying, oh, we're all a little bit blind. I mean, I guess there's different degrees of blindness, but most people don't
Mm-hmm.
go around with their vision regularly impaired.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and similarly, there's an experience of being autistic in the world or being an ADHDer in the world, which is far beyond the surface level traits, which really affects, everything about us, how we perceive, how we feel, how we process information, how we interact with others, the way that we make meaning in the world. So, things like that can be very negative. Also, one that you'll often see is the kind of superhero or the not superhero, superpower idea is, oh, these are superpowers. My ADHD is my superpower. My autism is my superpower. And, that can be kind of like this toxic positivity that really ignores the difficulty, marginalization, and disability that can be procured by these conditions. And yes, there are some people with these conditions who are able to utilize them in a superpower sort of way, but it's hardly universal. And it sets it up for this kind of trope of, unless you're useful in this particular way, then your humanity is suspect. We only want the superpowered autistics. We don't want the, severely disabled autistics who, can't speak and rock back and forth and self-injure because their sensory experience is so chaotic that they have to self-injure in order to control the environment around them, what goes in and out of their, or goes into their sensory processing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It does make me think though, like when I have ADHD as well. Um, and the way I think of it too is that it's just I don't have that filter, so everything's important. All the information's
Mm-hmm,
coming
mm-hmm.
in it as important and it's all hitting me. And so it's hard to filter out, like bring something from the background to the foreground because all of the information's important. And so it's like we're taking
Mm-hmm.
in all the information, all the sensations. And so there are some positives in that. So how do we have some kind of label or diagnosis and then also see that there are some positive aspects? Like how do we feel good about having these labels?
Mm-hmm. I think it's just a matter of self-acceptance,
Hmm.
recognizing that not everything about us is going to bring only positives. That we all have parts of our personalities that cause us trouble, whether or not they're, trauma based or just being human.
Hmm.
Um, and we can have full acceptance for who we are, even while we struggle with aspects of our personalities. Doesn't mean that sometimes it doesn't create difficulties that we wish were different, but that self acceptance piece, looking at things that are difficult without shame, and also identifying ways that it might make us unique and might make us, more enjoyable in certain ways. I think that my warmth and my humor directly comes from my ADHD. The intensity of my passions directly comes from my ADHD. My willingness to go off the beaten path and be brave when other people are not, I think is part of my impulsivity. And it also has, that impulsivity has opened so many pathways for me,
Mm-hmm.
and has forged connections that otherwise wouldn't have been there.
Mm-hmm.
So we look at it with a more even keel instead of, oh, this is just a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually really curious, as a clinical psychologist, what is different around the brains of somebody, an autistic person, a person with ADHD, an ADHDer. What is different? And I don't want to put that in like this is the right. There's a right, and then there's a wrong. But I'm wondering if there's things that show up on brain scans that are different.
Mm. So there are fMRI studies, and also MRI studies that do show certain differences among these different brain types. I want to go right out and say that there's this whole industry around Daniel Amen and SPECT scans. It's 100% BS.
Mm-hmm.
It's never been. SPECT scans aren't detailed enough. It's phrenology with a computer. And there's a whole line of good researchers who have disproven everything that this man claims he can do in his clinic, where he makes money, and he's the only one who could come up with the results. That being said,
Mm-hmm.
more detailed scans, MRI, fMRI, have shown that there are differences in there's this whole pituitary adrenal axis, the basal ganglia. I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist,
Mm-hmm.
which tends to be different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there seems to be a way that it's really more about how neurotransmitters work for ADHD. We don't have a lack of dopamine, but we are flooded with dopamine, which then gets the reuptake is very, very quick. And so what that translates to is like this intensity of experience followed by habituation to the experience. It's almost like addiction, right? It's like you have this like hit of experience, but then it loses its luster, and you need to like find novelty or find something really interesting or do something else in order to get that spike of dopamine again. So that's where there's this like constant need for novelty, and we move around, and we're trying to get a little bit of extra dopamine to
Mm-hmm.
concentrate. It seems to be a difference in the way that it's handled.
Mm-hmm.
In autistic brains, we think that the main mechanism is has to do with synaptic connections and pruning. So what that means is when we are born with an abundance of connections in our brain, more connections that we'll ever need, which makes us ripe for fitting into our culture and the tasks which are laid out before us. And by the time we're about 2-3 years old, those connections are actually severed, and our brains become a little bit less full of abundance, but also more attuned to the tasks of our specific social milieu.
Mm-hmm.
In autistic brains, that pruning process doesn't seem to occur. So there remains this hyper connectedness of brains, which is responsible for a lot of the genius and the crosstalk and the sensory experience, but also the overwhelm, the need for things to be the same, because information, just little bits of information, is being processed with like 15 times more neuronal activity than non-autistic brains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because you're so well versed in this arena, I'm curious, when we meet with autistic individuals and they come on a spectrum. Autism is on a spectrum. And so somebody might have autism that's really well and high functioning, and they can drive and hold a job and they're in relationship. And then there's the opposite, the spectrum, where they're really needing help with a lot of activities of daily living, and they might get sensory overwhelmed really, really easily. And I'm curious, if you have a room full of people with autism, are they able to relate with each other in a different way or in a way that's really unique where those of us that don't have that
Mhm.
neurodiversity can't understand or aren't able to tap into?
Haha. Okay, so let's start with term correction.
Yes,
Number
please.
one, number
Yes.
one, the terms high functioning and low functioning have been identified as being kind of implicitly ableist in
Okay.
that they grade in that they tend to grade people's worth on how they function in a moment, and also what functioning is more
Mm.
approved by dominant society.
I get that.
Um,
Yep.
so there are ways in which so we like to say instead high or low support needs.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I do
But
like that.
support needs can change based on moment to moment. So somebody who is seemingly high functioning can have major burnout and sensory overwhelm where they need extreme support for a little or a lot of time. And meanwhile, somebody who might be non-speaking might be incredibly brilliant and functional in many other ways. So we like to
Mm-hmm.
talk about level of support needs and also what are those specific support needs. And then we'd say that somebody without that form of neurodivergence. Neurodiversity means that everybody, we're neurodiverse people, but neurodivergent is a single person.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're talking about something called the double empathy problem,
Mm-hmm.
which was coined by autistic researcher Damian Milton. There's this assumption that autistic people lack empathy. And certainly there are some who have difficulty, who have low empathy, and then there are those who have very high empathy. The issue
Mm-hmm.
isn't empathy.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is you're working with different operating systems. So what Damian Milton found, what researchers are finding is kind of what you're saying, that autistic people, when brought together, seem to be able to communicate just fine and empathize just fine with each other. They just
Mm-hmm.
have difficulty with non-autistic people, but the same can be said for non-autistic people who just can't understand or empathize with the autistic experience.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that one is deficient and one is not. It's that you
Mm-hmm.
have people speaking different languages in a way and failing to communicate with each other. But because autistic people are the minority, they're labeled as deficient instead of different.
Mm-hmm.
There's no assumption that any two autistic people are going to get each other or get along. They might have very different
Yes.
values, sensory profiles, etc., or just might dislike each other for other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Autistic people can be, mean and judgmental and crappy, just like non-autistic people
Mm-hmm.
can be.
Well, I guess I'm curious if autistic people feel more seen by other autistic people or
I
not
I
necessarily.
I think definitely if they have, yes, there's an aspect of community there.
Okay.
Absolutely. But also, I think because we live in an ableist society and so many of us have what's called internalized ableism, that's where we internalize the shame of what society does. I've also seen autistic people be some of the meanest to other autistic people
Mm.
because they've internalized this stuff and they've probably um, had to mask or shame themselves and be somebody they're not. So when somebody reminds them of who they really are, they can get abusive and downright mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I should say the same thing about ADHDers is I think, one of the ways that I often joke in my assessment process is like, I know who the ADHD person is within 5 minutes of them walking in because without doing testing, because we just automatically start like getting into a groove and talking and bouncing off of each other. And the conversation goes into collaborative interrupting and off into the weeds. And the mask comes off.
Mm-hmm.
And I can always tell who the other ADHD person is, almost immediately,
Mm-hmm.
because they're a high masking person and very anxious, and then the whole thing. And I always do
Yeah.
the testing. We always go through the whole assessment process.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely, there's this comfort with other ADHDers that it can be almost immediate. And feel really good to be around. So I assume that autistic people probably have the same experience, though I'm not autistic. You might want to ask them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk about masking actually, because I'm
Mhm.
working with an autistic individual and talking to him about attending a support group. And he was talking about how he would need to go in and mask. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like, go in and be you. He doesn't like small talk. I'm like, great. Then just screw the small talk and like just go in. Like, this is an opportunity not to mask. And I think with anybody that has any kind of label, there is actually, even those that don't have labels of any kind, there's a lot of
Uh-huh.
masking in general in this world, and masking can be really exhausting and can really impact us. And so, and there's a lot of pressure on society for us to be a certain way, act a certain way. Like maybe if
Mhm.
somebody's fidgeting and they've been told since they were little, well, don't do that, don't do that. And then they're kind of holding things in. And so let's talk about masking, because I think it's dangerous for everybody, no matter who they are, to do
Right.
that.
Right. Well, you kind of said it, is that we have so many cultural rules about how you're supposed to emote, how you're supposed to act, what sensory stimuli you're supposed to respond to, and what you're not supposed to respond to. If I walk in a room and I respond to the people first, then I'm being right. If I walk into the room and I immediately go, oh, the heater is really loud, I'm going to go adjust the vent. Um, and oh my gosh, the way that the sun is reflecting against the window is making it impossible for me to be here, I'm going to adjust the curtains. I'm doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right, even though
Mm-hmm.
both ways are for me to feel comfortable in the room, and both
Mm-hmm.
ways might be a way to feel safety in the room before I'm going to interact.
Mm-hmm.
um, so masking really has profound consequences, where when you're masking what's going on in your sensory world and how you move to process information and process emotions and process your sensory experience, can lead to depression, burnout, suicidality, anxiety. um, so having places to unmask, learn to unmask, is very important. And,
Mm-hmm.
and that being said, there's some privilege to being able to unmask. A pretty white autistic woman can get away with being quirky. She's Zoe Deschanel. She's the new girl. She's this. She's there's the whole manic pixie dream girl trope,
Mm-hmm.
which is a whole thing to get into. Um, but a you know black autistic man suddenly stimming and melting down in public and get the police on them. And there have been autistic black
Mm-hmm.
men murdered by police because of their behavioral abnormalities. So the discourse around masking has to take into account different experiences
Mm-hmm.
of the people who have it. In some families, it's more safe than others. And yet, helping our clients find a safe place to unmask, and a safe way to unmask, even if it's just in the session, can be
Mm-hmm.
so liberating.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because it's making me think of my girlfriend came over with her two little boys, and one of them was recently diagnosed as having autism. But he came over to our house, and immediately he started opening all the doors and all the cabinets and went walking through the house and opening every single door and just mapping out the house.
Hmm.
And part of me was like, okay, that's interesting. But I loved how she let him do it and we let him do it. And then after that, he was fine. He just needed to know the layout of the house and he needed to know
Uh-huh.
what was behind every door. And she allowed that. And versus, I imagine if she was like, no, 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 don't do that, then that would create extreme anxiety for him, not knowing what's behind every single door.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, then he'd
Yeah.
have to mask that anxiety, and he'd probably be, distracted by that anxiety the whole time, and he'd come off, very
Hmm.
differently. Wouldn't be spontaneous in his communication. He would be, somewhat stunted because his mind is being taken away to this other stuff that he needs to feel comfortable.
Hmm.
The cognitive
Yeah.
load. That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, what are some of the biggest myths that you see around autism and ADHD that we just need to retire?
Oh, that's such a huge question.
Hmm.
I think the biggest one with autism has to do with the lack of empathy. That has been one that has really plagued autism studies for so long that they do not have a theory of mind is a big one. Theory of mind is my ability to theorize, to see that your mind is different and that you think differently. Let me picture what's going on in your mind. And there were some early studies that showed some difficulty, but there were some systematic issues with those studies. And, to this day, I'll still meet psychologists who'll do theory of mind studies as part of their diagnostic process, because they come from this assumption that autistic people lack empathy, which they do not. Some do, but some neurotypical people, or I was saying neurotypical, some allistic, non-autistic people lack empathy also. So it's not a characteristic of autism. When it I'd also say non-speaking doesn't mean intellectually disabled.
Yes.
In order to speak, there has to be a match of brain and motor functioning. And oftentimes it's a motor issue. It's not being able to form the words with the mouth and get it out. And I see so many parents talking about their non-speaking children as if they can't understand these horrific ways. They
oh
can
wow,
understand,
like saying things in front of them that they
because
shouldn't be speaking.
they
Yes,
assume if you
yes.
can't speak, then you can't understand.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely untrue. There are non-speaking autistic people with PhDs. So there's no correlation between ability to speak and intelligence or capacity to learn. Same can be said for those who experience extreme repetitive movements in order to deal with their sensory things. So the ones who are like, doing this kind of thing in order to manage their sensory experience, there's no correlation between that and being intellectually disabled either. So don't automatically assume that somebody lacks capability based on outward appearance. I would say the same can be said with ADHD as well. Just because we don't look like we're paying attention doesn't mean that we're not paying attention. A frequent argument that I'll get in with even my own mother, who should know better by now, is she'll be like, "You need to look at me. You're not paying attention. You're fidgeting your thing." And I'm like, "No, this is how I pay attention. If you want me to sit still and look at you, I'm not paying attention. I'm going off in my head. It might make you feel like I'm paying attention, but would you rather have the feeling of being paid attention or me actually paying attention?" So it's a that's something also. With ADHDers, we're often doing a lot of work in the back of our minds to prepare to do something big. And so often when we're looking like we're playing video games or, distracting ourselves, sometimes that is kind of a harmful avoidance. But a lot of times it's kind of getting ready to go. It's
What do you mean?
whipping up the dopamine in the back. It's like turning the engine on, but it's stalling a little bit because of the executive functioning difficulty. So oftentimes to do the hard thing, we need to kind of get our brains going with the easy thing, but also we're doing like a little bit of planning and thinking in the background. So one example that I love to give is, when I was in school, they'd always want us to, outline essays. I hated doing that. And when I got to college, I would never outline an essay. I would be planning it the whole time while I'm, doing other things. Then, can we curse here?
Yeah.
So the last minute, I call it going into oh shit mode. And when I get into oh shit mode, I get everything done.
Yeah.
And I graduated college with honors by doing everything in oh shit mode. And every once in a while, there was a sleepless night. Every once in a while, I'd have an immune system crash and get a bad cold or flu. But I graduated UCLA with honors. And I have so many clients who are just deeply ashamed at this, that they can't do it right. It's like the only reason they're saying you're not doing it right is because you're not doing it the way they want you to do it, but you're still doing it. So if you can embrace, this is just the way that I do it, and the only real consequence is sometimes I have to catch up on sleep, that's not so bad. It's just different.
Yeah. I'm wondering, really how we empower our children. I'm thinking of I I know I had ADHD when I was a kid, and I didn't get really diagnosed until 40 because I always just knew I had it.
Hmm.
And I thought that I was managing pretty well until I had a kid. And then it was just like that amount of stimulation just kind of threw me over the edge.
Hmm.
And then I got really horrible with my executive functioning. Um, and I remember not doing great in school. Like somebody would drop their pencils, I would run across the room and like go get them, like anything just to be distracted or anything to move. And sitting still was a nightmare.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I got horrible grades. And then finally, I think my mom and dad were like, okay, if you don't want to go to college, you can become a hairdresser or something like that. And something about that kicked in this motivation for me.
Hmm.
I ended up going to Tulane and getting a 3.9, but the only way I did it was like I locked myself. I lived alone, and I that was too many distractions. The phone would ring, I had the computer, the
Hmm.
cat, somebody would
Hmm.
knock on the door, and I lived alone and couldn't. And so I would go in to the library into a cubicle, and I would only take my books and my pen, and I would leave. That was
Yeah.
before cell phones, and I would just sit there until I was done, and I would leave. And it's the only way I got through grad school. So I learned how to adapt, but
Yeah.
I didn't learn that until I was in my early 20s. And now I'm
Right.
watching my kiddo who's been diagnosed with ADHD since he was 4, and his is pretty severe. And he needs more time. So he needs time and a half on his test. He needs more time, and we're always saying to him like, "You're smart. You just need more time. It just takes a little bit longer." But I can see how like something goes wrong, and he's like, "I'm stupid." Like this is getting implanted in his head,
Yeah.
and because something needs more time, or because he's not getting it right away, or because he needs to go through it like multiple times, or he's getting distracted at school. And so how do we raise these kids and without these labels that are getting placed on them by society and
Hmm.
themselves, when really I see him as super bright, just needing a little bit more
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
And maybe there's these accommodations that need to be put in place. But I think those are damaging when we place those labels on our kids or on ourselves.
Yeah. There's this kind of idea which is contested a little bit, but there's also a lot of really good research that shows this to be true, that what ADHD is a brain specialized for hunter-gatherer life that
Yeah.
is now forced to live in a static agricultural society that's settled.
Yeah.
And there's actually some studies that show this to be true. They put like ADHD people in hunter-gatherer computer simulations, and they tend to do better than non-ADHD people. The way that they utilize resources tends to be better. We have some really interesting studies about, you know, current hunter-gatherer, you know, tribes in Kenya, and the ADHD people seem to be like doing the best there, whereas their cousins who have settled down, it's the opposite. So a lot of it does have to do with recognizing that it's a failure of the system
Hmm.
to have multiple ways of teaching. That ADHD brains are really good at learning kinesthetically through interacting with things, through trial and error, through experience, through movement, um, and also in a way that's stimulating. So group learning can be really amazing. There's this thing called body doubling, where I can't get anything done really unless there's kind of another person to do it with. Even if we're doing completely different things, just the presence of another person. And there are like apps that you can do. So like sometimes I'll connect with some random person in Russia who's also ADHD, and we'll just say, okay, our goals are is to do this. My goal is to do this. All right, we'll check in 30 minutes. We're just on screen doing our thing. Um, so you know, there are all sorts of accommodations that can be made, understanding that learning just happens a little bit differently, that sitting down in a classroom passively taking in information does not work. And frankly, I don't think it really works well for anybody.
Hmm.
um, they're just able to kind of process it better in that, you know, situation than ADHD folks are. So I think incorporating movement, incorporating experience, discussion, anything that really makes learning more exciting and more experiential and hands-on is going to be great for ADHD people, but also I think for everybody.
Hmm. It's interesting when you shared your experience, because mine is I need complete silence and I need no
Hmm.
distractions and I need nothing around. Like another person, that would be, I couldn't, if somebody else was reading next to me, I would get distracted. So I need
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
alone. But it also makes me think, and I don't know if you can relate to this with the whole hunter gatherer piece.
Hmm.
When there's a crisis, my whole brain calms down and I get so
Hmm.
crystal clear.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The time that I had been the most clear my whole life was immediately following a near fatal car accident, where I was like
Wow.
bleeding from my head. I was like I was so clear. I saw everything. I knew what to do. Time slowed down. Yeah, and this tends to be a pretty universal ADHD experience, where in a crisis there's like a burst of dopamine and our brains just go online and we know exactly what to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, I've also heard too with ADHD, we're seeking stimulation
Hmm.
and sensory input, yet there's a point where there's too much and it tips us over the edge. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Well, I think that the capacity, I look at the nervous system almost like a cup that can grow and lower. So I think everybody gets to a point where their cup overflows and it screws you up. And the capacity of that cup, I think, changes through life, through what's going on, through stress, through the stimulation we've already had. Um, I think what often happens is we're so involved in our activity that we're not feeling that the cup is full until it's overflowing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I look, it's funny because like, I don't know if this is TMI, but like peeing is the same way for me. Like if I'm involved in an activity, like I don't feel that I have to go to the bathroom until it's like almost too late.
Yes.
Um,
That
and
was
I
my
think
kid
like,
too.
and I think like the stimulation aspect is the same way, as we're so much enjoying it and we're in it and we're not feeling that our nervous system is actually on edge and needs a break. And so,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I've been working with my clients and myself is to have that bodily awareness, to check in more with what does our body actually need, and is it okay to take a sensory break, to go be by yourself, to go on your phone or take a walk around the block and then go back to the party.
Mm-hmm. Is it universal that physical activity and exercise helps with ADHD? I mean, I'll speak for myself.
Hmm.
For me, it's an integral part of calming my nervous system. Is there's a certain amount of energy that I need to move a certain amount. I need to go to
Hmm.
the gym. I
Hmm.
need to work
Yeah.
out. And if I
Yeah.
don't, it has a negative impact. And I'm wondering, is
Yeah.
there a universal aspect to that?
So I couldn't tell you if it's universal, but I could tell you that there have been studies that have shown that exercise and regular intense exercise works just as good as some of the stimulant medication in managing ADHD, overt
Mm-hmm.
symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly for me, I need movement for emotional processing. So I will get like, I almost call it like emotional constipation. Like I'll start to shut down. I won't quite feel things. I won't be able to connect with my significant others. Um, I'll be just kind of like, ugh. And then I'll go for a swim, and I do like I'll swim for like 45 minutes to an hour, like a few days a week. And I could get into a real good meditative space and really start processing things and going through things. And, um, you know, it's also bilateral stimulation. So if
Yes.
EMDR people,
Yes. Yep.
the bilateral stimulation seems to help with emotional processing as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot get into a meditative space if I'm not moving. So if I'm sitting still, follow your breath. Like, no, my mind is out the door. My body rebels against that. Um, so, classic
Mm-hmm.
meditation would never work for me, but I could swim for an hour, 2 hours. Um, I was just in Mexico, and I went for a swim in the ocean, and I'm like, oh, I'll be back in half an hour. And I got back, and my partner was like, where the hell were you? I thought that you drowned. I'm like, oh, I went out for after. No, you've been gone for 2 hours.
Yeah, yeah,
I was just like
yeah.
totally out there, just like going up and down the coast. And I thought that I was, I totally
Hmm.
lost track of time. Yeah.
We got my kid into swim a couple of years ago, specifically for that bilateral stimulation and that
Hmm.
movement. And I'm like you, if you give me a garden tool and you send me outside, I disappear for hours.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. So I'm curious when everybody's experienced this situation where you're out at a restaurant or a public setting, and then um, there's somebody with autism, and they do have that meltdown where they're maybe a large kid or an adult, and they're on the ground, and like you can just tell that they're super stressed and sensory overload, and their system is just breaking down. As a bystander, what's the best way to? I don't know. It's not about offering support. I guess what's the best way to manage that? Is it better to ignore it? Is it better to like how do we because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I would probably say, as somebody who's raised an autistic son, the when those kinds of things happen, the feeling of isolation that you're in this alone, that people don't understand, can be the worst part about it. And
Yes.
so I guess I would say anything that would help with that, like somebody just coming over and being like, I've got an autistic kid too, or like, I see that this is a meltdown, good luck, or is there
Mhm.
any way that I could lend support? Sure.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Yeah. And do you feel like we're making progress as a society in this aspect of how we treat individuals with autism and ADHD? Or do you feel like we're really lagging behind, or do you think we're getting there slowly?
It's a slow climb, but I do think that there have been a lot of improvements.
Mhm.
Through the neurodiversity paradigm, through accommodations, we're now having a lot of, uh, you know, researchers and rule makers who have these conditions, who understand what it means, and are creating more and more spaces. I'm seeing like sensory friendly spaces in airports now. Um, so there are little bits here and there. There's still so much ableism and marginalization baked into our system that needs to continually be,
Mhm.
um, looked at and threatened, especially with what's going on with RFK's loony bin, and his anti-autism stuff. There's been some the roll the stone falling back into Sisyphus happening,
Yes.
um, or the rubber band flame, whatever metaphor you want to use.
Mhm.
Um, so there's been a lot more. I've seen more paranoia again about like vaccines and stuff. Like we had all but defeated the anti-vaxxer stuff for a very long time, and then when COVID happened, it like kind of came back. Um, so the vaccines do not cause autism. That's what I'm talking about. Is people thought that
Mhm.
vaccines cause autism. They don't.
Right. Right. So I guess since you do testing,
Mhm.
I'd like for you to talk about the benefits of getting tested. I have this client that I'm working with that has autism, and when I talk to
That's
him
autistic.
about he's autistic, and we've talked about that, and because of what's happening politically, he doesn't want to be labeled as having autism, and I can respect and understand that.
Sure.
And then my girlfriend just got a 22-page report where her kid was diagnosed with autism, and it has all these accommodations so that
Hmm.
she can get an IEP for her kid in school. And so I would love for you to talk to people who think that they're scared. Maybe they're scared to go get tested, or they don't really want to know, or they think the kid has ADHD, but they don't really understand the complexity of it. What is the value that somebody can get from testing?
So, there's this big debate about whether self-diagnosis is valid. I find that about 99% of people who come in and say, I think I'm autistic or I think I'm ADHD are correct.
Hmm.
So there are a few reasons why testing would be very helpful. The primary reason is just to identify it for oneself. I'm
Hmm.
not sure I need to know. And now that I know, there's all these resources out here that I could begin to organize my life around or get community. It's really essential if you're, autistic or ADHD to find others who are as well, so that you have people like you to be around. You can normalize it. It doesn't feel like shameful all the time. And of course, that doesn't mean you're going to automatically get along with everybody who has the same neurology. But finding groups of people or friends who have, who you can be on the same wavelength with, and it's just can be really, really amazing. Um, so yeah, so a lot of people will come in and just basically say, I think I have this, I've had this for my life, or I think my kid has this, and I just want confirmation.
Hmm.
That doesn't require too much testing.
Okay.
What requires more testing is when we get into needing to demonstrate disability and accommodation need, and like in school and workplaces, college often, getting an IEP. All of these things, it does require a lot more formal testing and more formal of an evaluation.
Hmm.
Um, and then, another thing that often comes up is people might have a more complex presentation, or they kind of don't know what it is. I have this, history of a lot of trauma, which makes me withdraw from people. Is my withdrawal due to trauma, or is it due to sensory sensitivities and being marginalized because I'm autistic? Or both at the same time. And so being able to piece out all of these different things. Oftentimes I'll get people who have kind of these subtle psychotic experiences. And is it overwhelmed due to, ADHD and autism, or is it actual, like the beginning of psychosis? Do I have these extremes of energy because I might be bipolar, because I'm just an ADHD, or sometimes,
Hmm.
feels very energetic and sometimes goes off the wall sometimes because I've been sitting
Hmm.
at school and then I get home from school and I just go bonkers.
Hmm. Well,
So,
schizoid can look like
mm-hmm.
autism. They look really
Yeah,
similar too.
they do. And I'm actually convinced that, so Nancy McWilliams wrote a book, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, and she writes this great chapter about schizoid personality types, and her like higher functioning schizoids like sound very much like every autistic person I've met. So I think she was
Yeah.
misidentifying that. So I think that is baked into the criteria. Although I have certainly met, through my testing, a number of folks who I say did have schizoid personality disorder who were not autistic.
Hmm. There's been a lot of studies that show that children with disabilities are more likely to experience abuse, physical, sexual, mental, emotional abuse.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about how trauma, complex trauma, PTSD affects autism, people with autism and ADHD.
So, I think there are similar genes which have been found in ADHD folks and folks who tend to dissociate. And there's some correlation between tendency to dissociate and who or who does not experience PTSD. So I think that, and then also what will make somebody experience PTSD is being kind of so overwhelmed by sensory experience that you freeze or dissociate. So I think that when ADHD and autistic people experience trauma, their tendency to develop a PTSD syndrome is probably more than people who do not have these conditions.
Hmm.
Um, Also, I would just say the kind of being alienated from others, in general, and being blamed all the time and not being understood. All these experiences make it harder to heal from trauma.
Hmm.
Um, the experience of being traumatized, the way it affects our nervous system is going to interact with whatever our neurological starting point is. So somebody who's already an ADHDer is already prone to being distracted, needing more and more stimulation to feel comfortable. And then that person gets traumatized, might be very high, even more highly distracted, might be much more attracted to substance abuse, because there's already this addictive potential based on the way the dopamine already works. Somebody with an autistic person might be so overwhelmed by their inner experience that they just can't, interact with anybody because the trauma happening in the background is just already too much for their nervous system to handle.
What are your thoughts about ADHD being rooted from trauma, coming out of trauma? And it could be generational trauma too. So
Yeah,
not
we're
just
talking about Gabor Mate. Nope.
epigenetics. No.
Yeah, there's certainly something to be said for epigenetics and generational trauma, although how much this is psychological versus the biological epigenetics in humans, we still really don't have any studies on that. There have been some results in rat studies, but I don't think those are generalizable. So my dissertation was actually on how this works in the attachment system. Is that there are attachment systems that can be dysregulated and dissociative and create further trauma around the way that we think about things, and then there's just cultural transmission of symbolism and things like that, which it becomes very complex. There is no at all indication that ADHD or autism is a trauma response, but trauma can certainly exacerbate the more overt symptoms of both of these ways of being, in a way that makes them look much more overt. So it's understandable why people might think that.
Can you speak more about the attachment piece?
Well, yeah. So there's this thing called a disorganized attachment style, which is essentially if your caregiver has unresolved trauma that they are acting out in the relational space, it creates this fear of them. They're acting in ways that are unexpected, that are scary, and it creates a dissociative attachment style, which then sets you up for further traumatization later.
Okay.
And this comes from the work mainly of Mary Main and her colleagues.
Yeah. What would be one mindset shift that you wish every listener could walk away with after this conversation?
I would want them to look up and read and internalize Nick Walker's Golden Rule of Neurodiversity, which says, respect the bodily, sensory, and cognitive needs of others as you would want your own to be respected, whether or not you understand the reasons for these needs. And I emphasize that last part because people tend to gaslight, dismiss, and validate if your needs and what you're saying you need doesn't match my expectation of what people should need. I tend to invalidate it. Not me personally, but I'm talking about the royal we. The royal we tend to invalidate it. And so Nick Walker challenges us to just listen to people. And when they say they need something for their emotional regulation, for their sensory world to feel safe, to pay attention, just because it looks different doesn't mean that there's invalid to what they're saying. If this is what they're saying they need, then give it to them, just as if there's something that you felt you would need for the same, you would want others to give that to you.
Yeah. And I think there's also this piece about radical acceptance for where somebody is. Actually, all people, if we could do that, but without judgment, without imposing our wants and needs and desires, just radically accepting everyone as they are. Yeah.
I would agree.
Joel, I love chatting with you. How can people connect with you? I'll drop all of your information in the show notes, but I'd love for you to share anything that you'd like to share that we haven't spoken about, or how can people find you? What offerings you might have?
Yeah, so a few things. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. I'm currently my practice is total spectrum counseling, but I think in the next month or two, I'll be changing to something called Neuro Pathways, which is going to be neuro-pathways.org or .com, one or the other. I can't remember at this moment because I just registered it. I have trainings on the Chicago School of Professional Psychology's continuing education website on ADHD and autism. One's 8
What are,
hours, one is 10 hours.
what are those trainings?
They're continuing education trainings. Yeah, so the first one is called Challenging Myths About Autism, What Assessors and Therapists Need to Know, Lessons from the Neurodiversity Movement. And that really does a deep dive into the lived experience of autism and challenges these things. It challenges the whole empathy issue. It challenges that ABA is effective therapy. It challenges the extreme male brain theory. It challenges the way that, and it gives you a template for doing therapy from a neurodiversity affirming standpoint.
Nice.
And then I did this other training along with Reese Ramponi, who is a ADHD and autistic psychiatric nurse practitioner. And that course is called Neurodiversity Affirming Understanding and Care for ADHD. And we go into assessment, medication, neurodiversity affirming ways of working with it. There's a lot of talk about, different cultural experiences, etc.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. You are amazing. You came very, very highly recommended. So I feel very privileged to have you on the podcast today. And I really want to thank you. And I really value our conversation so much. I think it's so important. And thank you for all the work that you're doing in this world.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate that. I do.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Community Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I can be found at www.nikkiyyoga.com, NICKYYYOGA.com. Until I see you again next week, I hope you have a beautiful day.